3 a.m. on a lonely stretch of highway outside a town most maps had forgotten. A thin mist hung low over the asphalt, headlights cutting slices of light through the cold air, and a sense of wrongness settling like a weight in the chest. Daniel Mercer was driving because he always drove when he could not bear the silence at home. He had been on the road for hours, radio static and the smell of stale coffee filling the cab, when something impossible stepped into the beam of his lights. He slowed without thinking, pulled to the shoulder, and felt the truck tremble under his hands like a sleeping animal being woken. He opened the door, and there it was, a figure, standing at the edge of the fog, neither wholly human nor visibly monstrous, an outline that caught the light in a way that made him sick with recognition and wonder at the same time. He had meant to pass it by and disappear into the safety of motion. Instead, he offered a ride out of habit more than compassion. He had not planned to become the center of an event that would unmake, then remake his life. What happened after that ride would challenge everything Daniel believed about guilt and redemption, about heaven and hell as states of being rather than places, and about the very meaning of presence. If you have ever felt like some unseen force was nudging at your life, share it below and tell us how it felt. If you are new here, subscribe to a channel that treats the strange with care, because stories like this are not just spectacle, they are invitations to change. This is Daniel Mercer, 46 years old, once a family man, now a man with a suitcase of loss, a daily practice of avoidance, and a voice in his head that would not stop saying, "I did not do enough." The cab smelled of motor oil, damp clothes, and the bitter tang of coffee gone cold. The fog tasted like pennies on his tongue when he leaned out to breathe, and the sound of tires hissing on wet asphalt kept time with his heartbeat. He felt the presence before he saw the details, a pressure, low and insistent against the skin, like someone standing too close on purpose, and an odd sweetness undercut by ozone, like the air before a thunderstorm. He told himself to be careful. He told himself he had driven past drifters and strangers many times and had done what was expected and what was safe. He told himself nothing else until the stranger climbed into the passenger seat and sat with a posture that made the leather sigh. Their eyes were not eyes as he understood them, but surfaces reflecting back the world in small, perfect slices, a flash of stars in a shape that said, "Listen." The stranger spoke, a soundless first phrase that Daniel felt more than heard, a touch on the inside of his sternum that opened something tender and raw. The stranger reached out and placed a palm on the dashboard, and a warmth spread from that point like heat moving through an old metal. Daniel said, "Are you real?" The stranger said, "I am as real as feeling." Daniel said, "What are you?" The stranger said, "I am a messenger of consequence." Daniel said, "Of what?" The stranger said, "Of the frequencies you carry." Daniel said, "Frequencies of what?" The stranger said, "Guilt, sorrow, love, and the choices that tune you to one reality or another." Daniel said, "Are you saying heaven and hell are frequencies?" The stranger said, "Exactly that, and more than that." Daniel said, "Why me?" The stranger said, "Because you are listening, because your chest is open and heavy, and because you have been looking for proof that you can change." Daniel said, "I cannot change everything I ruined." The stranger said, "You are not asked to fix a past that is fixed. You are asked to change the frequency of the present." This exchange, a handful of sentences in a roadside conversation, expanded into a dialogue that lasted hours because neither of them could find a reason to stop. They traded questions and answers like coins, each one revealing a possibility and inviting a practice. Around them, the night made small noises, the truck fan clicked, the distant hum of an invisible insect filled the air, and a low wind moved across the road like a whisper. The first hour after the stranger got into the truck was small talk that grew into confessions. Daniel told stories about his ex-wife Nina, their son Luca, and the year he had been away, drunk enough to lose an entire existence to alcohol. He spoke of nights when he had woken, thinking the house had a heartbeat he had broken. The stranger did not judge, only reflected with a clarity that made the details hurt less and mean something. Daniel felt a pressure release in his chest, like someone had taken a weight away and replaced it with a map. The map began with three things: a practice of breath, a daily commitment of gratitude, and a small ritual of facing a single memory neutrally. The stranger explained with patient images about frequencies how guilt is an energy that loops and how forgiveness shifts a frequency, like tuning a radio away from static toward melody. Daniel listened with the raw hunger of someone who had been starved for hope. The stranger offered an exercise and guided him through a breath that felt like a small birth. The air tasted metallic, then sweet, and Daniel felt tears sting at the corners of his eyes as memory and forgiveness braided into the same motion. This was the pickup, the initial decision that set the plot in motion, and it was recorded in Daniel the way a deep wound records a scar. The stranger had an odd vocabulary, mixing simple verbs and metaphors about light and roads, about frequencies and choice that made the mundane strange and the strange accessible. After a while, Daniel asked the obvious pragmatic question, "Show me proof." The stranger leaned forward and pushed something across the dash, a small, smooth stone that glowed faintly with the same reflected starlight as in his eyes. Daniel reached out, fingers brushing something warm and solid, and the smell of rain again rose in his nose like a promise. The stone left a mark on his skin, an indentation of heat that faded into a scar shaped not like wound, but like a punctuation that read, "You were touched." Back in town, deputies would later note the glow in the truck that could not be explained, and Sheriff Tom would write a report that mentioned nothing supernatural and everything unusual. The first weird signs that something was not ordinary were small hairs standing on the back of the neck, a low ringing in the ears like distant bells, and the occasional memory of voices not his that spoke in words he then understood as if he were remembering rather than hearing. He noticed patterns of electricity that exaggerated simple gestures, lights blinking in the exact rhythm of his breath, and radios coming to life with static that turned into phrases he later repeated in his head. These were the signs of anomaly, the first revelations that forced doubt into the sensible world and made the ordinary two-sided and dangerous because you could no longer rely only on the visible. In those moments, he was helped and hindered by people who mattered. Elena, his sister, who was a nurse in the local clinic, refused to believe anything supernatural and offered practical help cleaning out bottles and contacting a therapist. Marcus, his neighbor at the mechanic shop, watched with the skepticism of a man whose life had little room for mystery and more room for work. Father Louise from the old parish said he would pray, but warned about taking spirits at their word without discernment. Dr. Amuna Reyes, a psychologist from the Community Mental Health Center, offered a model of trauma and neuroplasticity that made the stranger's teaching sound less like fantasy and more like a parallel language describing the same map. Karen, the barista where Daniel sometimes slept during the day, told him she had seen lights in the sky that night too, and Jonah, a teenager from down the road, claimed he found crop circles in the field next to his house, the pattern identical to the stone on the dash. Leela, the school teacher, organized a small support circle and asked to see the mark on Daniel's wrist, and then organized meals and tough love. Naming all these people and giving them actions helped anchor the story in a community where reaction ranged from compassionate curiosity to protective denial and to the desperate need for proof. The backstory that made Daniel receptive to such a visitation is long enough to deserve its own space because it explains why someone hardened by years of neglect and personal failure could be opened by a touch. Daniel was born the second child of a family that never had enough. In childhood, small acts of tenderness alternated with long silences, and a father whose hands taught him to fix engines and to hide feelings. He learned to stop asking for help when his mother's eyes went blank, which trained him to hold shame behind the ribs. He chose work because it was practical and reliable, because warehouses and shipping schedules did not need explanations or apologies. Love arrived in his 20s in the shape of Nina, a school librarian whose laugh curated the light out of the room. They married young because he wanted a chance to make good and she wanted someone steady. They had Luca, who brightened mornings and then nights when Daniel turned toward the bottle and away from home. The loss came slow, months of missed recitals and apologies that became habits of absence, until one day Nina left with a single bag and the rest of her life. Daniel sank into a small daily death of routine and blame, and told himself he had no right to joy. The present after these losses was a pattern of avoidance and self-punishment, a man who kept a list of his wrongs and called it truth. This backstory shows why the touch of the stranger landed like a seed in soil that had been made thin and hungry, because it meant the difference between a heart closed in guilt and a heart that could practice forgiveness. The loss and the choices that followed were the proof that change mattered. The scene of epiphany came on a low, rainy night when the stranger asked Daniel to drive to the old bridge where he had once parked as a younger man and wrestled with the idea of leaving. The rain came as sound, its rhythm a drum on the cab, and the smell of wet asphalt was sharp and alive. As they parked, the stranger invited him to step out and feel the rain, not as an enemy but as a cleansing agent. They spoke, and the conversation deepened into a monologue about the nature of hell as not a place of brimstone, but a frequency of isolation and unprocessed guilt, and about heaven as a frequency of connection and presence. Daniel argued with the stranger with the wounded stubbornness of someone who had survived through the Nile. The stranger did not win by force, but by patient unraveling, asking Daniel to recall one single moment, choose it, look at it without defaulting to self-censure, and be present to it as if it were someone else's pain. Daniel resisted, said it would tear him apart, and the stranger said that was the point, and that tearing open sometimes lets light enter. The tension there was thick, the rain ringing the question like a bell, and the decision to open came slowly like a release valve. He cried then, and the tears were tasted like saline sweet, and his shoulders dropped an inch. He had not realized were held up tight for decades. This moment was an epiphany, followed by a decision, and it set the tone for the rest of the work, because it moved him from disbelief to a willingness to practice. The proof, physical, that removed the last of rational doubt arrived in small layered ways. There was the stone that glowed and left a mark. There were electronics in town behaving strangely at the moment he returned from the bridge. Phones picking up fragments of the stranger's voice on recordings, and a local farmer finding the same pattern etched in a field. A mid-level technical description helps here to show how people who knew science reacted. The mark on the wrist displayed micropigmentation that did not register as burn nor bruise under forensic spectral photography, but emitted faint infrared signatures consistent with thermal activity, a trace without clear origin. Dr. Amina described this to Daniel with clinical calm and proposed that some unknown electromagnetic event had altered the skin chemistry in a way that science could measure but not yet explain. The combination of community witness, physical trace, and the personal shift in Daniel's behavior created a suite of proofs that withstood casual dismissal and forced investigation. The teaching that followed from the stranger was less about doctrine and more about practices specific and repeatable. He taught a three-part routine to shift frequency that Daniel could do in 5 minutes each morning and again at night. The routine began with breathing into the place of the heart, 5 slow counts in, 5 slow counts out, with imagery of light expanding. Then with a gratitude listing of 3 things, no matter how small, and finally with a naming and neutral re-experience of one memory for no more than 2 minutes, followed by a restorative phrase, I release the hold and choose presence. The stranger spoke of love as a vibration and guilt as a weight that could be lifted when addressed regularly. He called it daily practice, and said that daily practice moves internal magnets and changes how we relate to our own shadow. Daniel practiced in the truck, in a gas station bathroom, and later in a tiny back bedroom he rented. He stumbled and he relapsed, and support came in forms practical and human. Elena drove over with casseroles and tough conversation. Marcus offered shifts at the shop so Daniel could have steady income and less idling time. Father Lewis offered counsel and cautioned about adult discernment. Dr. Amina held space for therapy and neurobiological explanations, and Lila's group became a place to report successes and failures. The dialogues in the teaching scenes are detailed and dense because they show the translation from otherworldly metaphor to a protocol one can use. In one long exchange, Daniel asks the stranger what forgiveness really means, and the stranger answers with a metaphor about tuning forks and a practical instruction about writing a letter, never sent but read aloud into the wind and then burned to symbolize release. The stranger then guides him through a visualization of walking from a dark hall into a lighted courtyard, meeting people from his past who speak brief phrases of truth, and receiving them without collapsing into guilt. These guided exercises incorporate sensory anchors: vision of light, the smell of flowering trees, the feel of sunlight on skin, the sound of voices in the courtyard, and the taste of cool water at the end of the path. Each exercise uses multiple senses and ties feeling to action. The process of healing is not linear, and moments of high tension return like storms that test resolve. One such tense moment came when Nina reappeared months later asking for closure. For 572 characters, he sat across from her at a cheap diner, listening to the clatter of plates, the coffee smell, and the fluorescent lights that made everything look too honest. He felt his old reflex to shrink into blame. The stranger's teachings surfaced a different path, and he practiced presence and confession, and a short but deeply felt apology that did not demand forgiveness as a currency, but offer truth. Another tense moment occurred when a local blogger accused him of attention-seeking and public shaming made public the strange events. For 512 characters, Daniel weathered the humiliation and chose to continue the practice, and to invite others into a circle where experience and skepticism could coexist. A third high-tension moment happened when someone in the support group threatened to leave with a personal secret and take it to the press, which would have re-traumatized more than healed. For 534 characters, the group rallied with honest rules about confidentiality and protection and worked to rebuild trust. Each of these amplified tensions tested the integrity of the new frequency Daniel tried to hold, and each ultimately strengthened the daily practice he kept. Alongside emotional work, there were technical process explanations that grounded the extraordinary in plausible mechanisms and gave comfort to the skeptical. For example, a short procedural description explained how the spectral imaging on Daniel's wrist was done, and how thermal mapping can reveal anomalous activity in tissue without typical inflammatory markers. Another simple explanation described how grounding techniques used in trauma therapy alter sympathetic activation by shifting breathing patterns, slowing the heart rate, and enabling prefrontal cortex engagement. Each technical note is explained in plain language and kept brief to maintain narrative flow. Transformation, practical and visible, began with small acts. Daniel quit drinking by setting a rule: no alcohol before noon, then no alcohol at all, and using the breath practice when cravings hit. He began calling his son with short, honest messages and showing up at school events that felt like small restorations of trust. He started volunteering at Lila's after-school program, telling stories about engines and places, and gradually rebuilt a version of himself that could be entrusted with care. People noticed. Karen from the diner said his face seemed softer and more present. Marcus stopped leaving tools on his seat as guilty tokens and instead offered to teach Luca to change oil. Sheriff Tom made a quiet joke in public about Daniel being a new man and then told him privately that he was glad Daniel was safer on and off the road. These scenes are rich with sensory detail: the clank of pots at the diner, the warmth of hands on wrench metal, the smell of frying onions, and the small bright tinkle of a child's laugh when Daniel successfully fixed a broken bicycle. The community responded with a web of human reactions: skepticism, curiosity, caution, and eventually support. Around the 33% mark in this narrative, pause to consider what this means for you, the viewer. If you are skeptical, that is valid. Almost everyone in Daniel's town was skeptical at first. If you are curious, that is good. It means you are listening. Share in the comments with a short sentence beginning, "Once I felt," to tell us the closest thing to the inexplicable you have experienced. Your small story matters because community is part of healing, and hearing others makes us braver. If this story moves something in you, subscribe to a channel that brings responsibly researched stories and accessible practices into the light. After the listener engagement pause, the story continues with proof and consequences. The stranger did not leave without clarifying responsibility. He gave Daniel a small object sealed in a linen bag and told him to keep it until he could give it away with intention. He also warned that protection was not about building walls, but about tending the frequency of his life. Over the next weeks, minor miracles accumulated. A neighbor's barn fire was smothered inexplicably early, giving an unburned, charred pattern that townsfolk later called a sign. Jonah, the teenager, claimed a crop circle detail matched a sequence of notes Daniel hummed during his practice. Dr. Amina logged improvements on Daniel's mood scales, and his therapist noted decreased avoidance behavior and better sleep. Practical consequences included offers from a regional charity for Daniel to help with logistics thanks to his reliable presence, and Leela organizing a community circle that created a small fund for fathers who had lost their families. The epilogue shows sustained change across time, 1 month, 3 months, and 6 months, and must show detail and consequence. 1 month later, Daniel had a steady rhythm. He practiced breath and gratitude each morning and night and had begun journaling small victories. He attended a community potluck where he sat with Nina but kept the... Elena reported watching him do his breathing in the garage and smiled through worry. He had one relapse day where a siren in the night called old habits, but he used the grounding technique and walked instead of drinking. The community began to see him as someone willing to do the hard work, not as a man with an exotic story, but as a man who showed up. 3 months later, Daniel had rebuilt proxy trust with his son Luca, who now came to the mechanic shop on weekends, and they worked on a truck together, learning to talk about feelings through action. The support group had formalized into a small, ongoing circle led by Lila with rotating facilitation, and Dr. Amina provided occasional clinical oversight. Sheriff Tom had donated an old coffee maker to the group, and Marcus had taught a basic tool safety class that doubled as a men's meeting place. Daniel spoke publicly at a small town hall about addiction and accountability, and the stranger's teachings about frequency were discussed not as supernatural dogma, but as practical metaphors for behavior change. People in town began to use the phrase, "tune your frequency," when encouraging each other. 6 months later, there was a measurable shift in the town culture. A local nonprofit applied for a grant to expand the father-son program Daniel had helped start, citing lower juvenile complaints in the area and better school attendance from kids who participated. Daniel had a living space that smelled like clean laundry and fresh coffee, and his habit of daily gratitude had turned into a small habit of stopping to say one thing he appreciated out loud before bed. Nina and Luca had a day together that included a slow breakfast and an afternoon at the park, rebuilding a language of presence and trust. The stranger's object in the linen bag had been given away to a neighbor who needed an anchor, and who later reported a night of vivid dreams that led him to reconcile with an estranged sibling. The town story became an example for nearby communities about integrating mystery and practice into social healing. The conclusion of this narrative brings together the image of the road, the touch, and the changed life into a synthesis and a short practice for viewers. That night, the road did not only stop a truck, it stopped a life in patterns and opened a way forward. The lesson Daniel learned was that heaven and hell are not categories imposed from above, but frequencies we tune to by the way we carry our guilt and the way we practice forgiveness. 3 small steps you can do today. 1. Take 3 slow heart breaths and feel your chest lighten. 2. Write down one memory you will face neutrally for 2 minutes and then place it in a box as a symbol of release. 3. Say out loud, "I choose presence," and mean it for the next 3 days. These steps are small and concrete, and they translate an encounter with the impossible into a daily practice of change. If this story moves something in you, please leave a brief comment, begin with "Once I felt," and tell us one moment where the inexplicable touched your life. And subscribe for more stories that combine careful reporting, compassion, and practical tools. The last image is of Daniel standing at the same roadside months later, not as someone waiting for rescue, but as someone who has learned to offer himself presence and protection in the form of steady habits and compassionate truth. The stranger's visits did not end in fanfare, but in a quieter revolution, a transformation that rippled out into a community and taught that touching the inner shadow with discipline and kindness can change the frequency of a life and sometimes of a town. If you want more guides to practical spiritual work, check the links below. And remember that transformation is not instant, but it is real and begins with a single present breath.